September 2nd, 7:15 p.m., Naeem Khan. I never thought my marriage would turn into this, a cold, distant arrangement where we barely acknowledged each other. When I married Daniel, I believed in the promise of love, of partnership. But over the years, he became more of a stranger than a husband. Work consumed him, and our conversations dwindled to nothing but routine exchanges. I would wait for him at dinner, only to eat alone most nights. Even when he was home, his eyes were glued to his phone, his mind somewhere else. Loneliness became my shadow, following me through every empty room of this house. I tried everything, new hobbies, dressing up, even planning surprise dates, but nothing could pull him away from his world. The silence between us stretched longer, colder, until I stopped trying. I convinced myself this was normal, that love fades with time, that I should be grateful for what I had. But gratitude felt impossible when I spent every night yearning for something more. Then there was Ryan, Daniel's son from his first marriage. He had been living with us for a while, a young man in his early 20s, full of energy and charm. At first, we had the usual polite exchanges, but lately, I found myself looking forward to his presence. He actually noticed me, asked how my day was, laughed at my jokes. It was harmless, I told myself. Just a connection I desperately needed. One evening, I struggled to fix a cabinet door that had come loose. Frustrated, I sighed, rubbing my temples. "Need a hand." Ryan's voice came from behind me. I turned to see him leaning against the counter, arms crossed, a small smile playing on his lips. His confidence, his ease, it was something I hadn't felt from Daniel in years. "Yeah," I admitted, stepping aside. He moved in close, the scent of his cologne lingering between us. With quick, practiced movements, he secured the hinge.
"See?
"Easy," he said, wiping his hands. I smiled. "Guess I'm just not good with these things." "You're good at plenty," he said, eyes lingering on mine for just a second too long. A flicker of something passed between us, a moment neither of us expected. I looked away first, laughing softly to break the tension. "Thanks, Ryan." "Anytime," he said, voice softer now. That night, as I lay in bed beside my husband, who had already turned away from me, my mind kept replaying that moment. The way Ryan looked at me, the way, for the first time in forever, I felt seen. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting moment, a harmless exchange. But deep down, something had shifted. And once that door was cracked open, there was no shutting it again. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The way Ryan looked at me wasn't accidental. It wasn't imagined. And the way I felt when he was near, it was something I had long forgotten. That night, long after Daniel had fallen asleep, I found myself restless, my mind circling the same thought. Was I reading too much into this? I got up for some water, hoping the quiet of the kitchen would settle my nerves. But as I reached for a glass, I heard footsteps. "Ryan." "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head. "You?" He exhaled, leaning against the counter. "Not really." We stood there for a moment, the silence between us heavier than it should have been. Then, before I could stop myself, the words slipped out. "I think I've forgotten what it feels like to have someone really see me." He didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked like he understood. "You're not invisible," he said, his voice firm. "Not to me." Something in my chest tightened. I should have laughed it off, changed the subject, walked away, but I didn't. I just stood there, staring at him, at the way his expression was open, unafraid. "You don't have to say that," I murmured. "But I mean it." He took a step closer. I could feel the warmth of him now. Too close, too dangerous. My heart pounded, not from fear, but from something far worse, wanting. His hand brushed against mine, just barely, but it was enough to send a current through my skin. I should have pulled away. I should have reminded him, reminded myself, that this wasn't right. But instead I stayed. The weight of everything unspoken sat between us. The way my husband never touched me anymore, never asked how I was. The way Ryan noticed every little thing. The way he looked at me now, as if I were the only person in the world. I swallowed hard. "Ryan, we can't." "I know," he said, but he didn't step back. His fingers brushed against mine again, deliberate this time. My breath hitched. The moment stretched, unbearable, electric. A noise from the hallway snapped me back to reality. I stepped away as if burned, my pulse hammering. Ryan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "We should go back to bed," I whispered, though sleep was the last thing on my mind. He nodded, but as I turned to leave, he called after me. "Good night." I didn't answer. I couldn't, because for the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about my husband. I was thinking about Ryan, and that terrified me. October 2nd, 7:22 p.m. Naeem Khan. I was exhausted, the weight of the day pressing against me as I drove down the empty highway. My fingers gripped the wheel, my mind lost in thoughts of a marriage that had grown stale. The silence in my car was more comforting than the silence at home. I barely noticed my speed creeping up until flashing red and blue lights filled my rearview mirror. A sigh left my lips. Just my luck. I pulled over, heart pounding, not from fear of a ticket, but from the sheer annoyance of it all. The door of the patrol car opened, and she stepped out. Slim, confident, and radiating authority, she approached my window, her gaze sharp but with an unmistakable glint of amusement. "Going a little fast tonight, weren't we?" she said, voice smooth, almost playful. I swallowed. Didn't realize. Just trying to get home. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "License and registration." I handed them over, watching as she walked back to her cruiser. The wait felt longer than usual, my mind drifting between frustration and something else, something I couldn't quite place. When she returned, she held out the ticket, but before I could take it, she hesitated. A small smirk tugged at her lips. "Try to slow down next time." Then, with a flick of her wrist, she slipped the ticket into my hand, fingers brushing mine for just a second longer than necessary. I barely noticed her walking away, my eyes fixed on the paper. I flipped it over. A phone number. My pulse jumped. This had to be a mistake. Cops didn't do this. I glanced up, but she was already getting into her car, the glow of her taillights disappearing into the night. The drive home was a blur. I kept looking at the number, fingers itching to dial, to text something. But I didn't. I shoved the ticket into my glove compartment the second I pulled into my driveway. Inside, my wife was already asleep, curled up on her side of the bed, back turned to me. No greeting, no warmth. I sat on the edge, rubbing my face, the ticket burning a hole in my mind. I wasn't a cheater. I wasn't the kind of man who did this. But then why couldn't I stop thinking about her? The number sat in my glove compartment for days, untouched but never forgotten. Every time I got in my car, I felt its presence, like a secret waiting to be exposed. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting moment of curiosity. But that was a lie. The temptation lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. One night after. The first time it happened, I told myself it was a mistake. A lapse in judgment. A moment that got out of hand. She had asked me to meet her. Said she had something to show me. I told myself it was harmless, that it was just another conversation, another excuse to be around her. But when I got into her car, the air between us was different. Charged. Her hand rested lightly on the steering wheel, nails tapping against it. "You trust me?" I nodded, knowing I shouldn't. She drove us somewhere quiet, a place I didn't recognize. No words were exchanged, but the tension filled every inch of the space between us. When she finally turned to me, her eyes locked onto mine, daring me, testing me. "You've been thinking about this as much as I have," she said. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. She leaned in first. Or maybe I did. It didn't matter. The moment our lips met, every excuse, every justification, every bit of resistance shattered. It wasn't just the kiss. It was the way her fingers traced the back of my neck, the way her breath hitched when I pulled her closer. It was the way, for the first time in years, I felt like I was awake. When it was over, I expected regret to hit me like a tidal wave. Instead, I only felt a hunger for more. "This doesn't have to mean anything," she murmured. But we both knew that was a lie. That night, I went home and showered twice, scrubbing away invisible evidence. My wife barely looked up from her book when I crawled into bed beside her. She didn't notice the way my hands shook, the way my heart raced for reasons that had nothing to do with her. I should have stopped, but I didn't. One time became two, then three. Then I lost count. It was never planned, but it was never accidental either. We found stolen moments, excuses to be together. Lunch breaks turned into hours spent in the back seat of her car. Late-night drives ended in whispered promises we both knew we'd break. I told myself I wasn't in love with her. I convinced myself this was just about excitement, about something new. But then I started craving her voice, her touch, the way she made me feel like someone I used to be. Lies became second nature. I got better at covering my tracks, at coming up with reasons for why I was late, why I was distant. My wife stopped asking, stopped looking at me the way she used to. And just like that, the life I had carefully built began to crack. I knew it would fall apart eventually. Affairs don't stay hidden forever. Lies have a way of unraveling, no matter how carefully they're spun. It happened on a night like any other. I walked through the door, expecting the usual silence, the usual routine. But my wife was waiting for me, phone in hand, her face unreadable. "Who is she?" My stomach dropped. The question was quiet, controlled. That was worse than shouting. I glanced at the phone in her hand. My messages were open. The ones I thought I had deleted. There was no way out of this. No excuse that could erase the proof in front of her. "How long?" she asked. I opened my mouth, but no words came. She nodded, like she already knew. Maybe she had known for a while. Maybe she had just been waiting for confirmation. "I'm done," she said, voice steady but hollow. The weight of those words crushed me more than I expected. I had spent months chasing something new, something exciting. But standing there, watching my wife, realize she didn't love me enough to fight for me anymore, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Panic. I tried to say something, but what could I say? That it was a mistake? That it didn't mean anything? That would have been a lie. She walked past me, toward the bedroom. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of a suitcase zipper. It was over. I left before I could watch her go. I drove without a destination, ending up in the only place that felt familiar. I called her, the officer, the woman I had risked everything for. She didn't answer. I tried again. Nothing. It wasn't until later that I saw her, back in uniform, acting like nothing had happened. When our eyes met, there was no warmth, no longing, just a small, knowing smile. "It was fun," she said. "But you knew this was never forever." I laughed, but it wasn't from humor. It was the kind of laugh that comes when you realize just how much you've lost. She walked away without another word. That night, I sat in my car, staring at the old ticket, the number that had changed everything. I tore it in half. It didn't matter anymore. Nothing did. By the time I got home, she was gone. The house felt different, emptier, like something had been ripped out of it. I sat on the bed that wasn't mine alone anymore and realized something I should have known from the start. Some mistakes you don't come back from.